Good evening, alumni and friends, and welcome to the 2023 Zagoren Lecture. My name is Lee Brodsky-Schubert, class of 2004. I am the AADC Lecture Committee Chair, and we're very excited about tonight's lecture featuring Cierra Kaler-Jones, class of 15. A formal introduction of Cierra will be forthcoming. Inaugurated in 2004, the Zagoren Lecture is presented by the Associate Alumnae of Douglas College in honor of the late Adelaide Marcus Zagoren, class of 40. Forging two distinguished careers, Adelaide was administrator of three large nonprofit organizations in New Jersey: the Raritan Valley Girl Scout Council, the United Way of Greater Middlesex County, and for 26 years, the executive director of the Associate Alumnae of Douglas College. Additionally, she served as trustee and president of the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation, a philanthropic organization that we are proud to partner with this year for the AADC 100th Anniversary Women's Conference, Women Moving Forward. AADC President Jean Fox will share brief remarks momentarily. But first, we will hear from Laura Zagoren Barron, class of 70, daughter of Adelaide.
Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone here to the annual Zagoren Lecture. This lecture is presented today on the internet, which actually more alums from all over can attend. And in fact, today, our attendees range in class year from 1951 to 2018 and live in 19 different states. The Zagoren Lecture has always been free and open to the public and honors my mom, Adelaide Marcus Zagoren, class of 40, executive director of the Associate Alumnae for 26 years. This was always one of my mom's favorite events, bringing back former Douglas students to discuss their careers and how Douglas College has influenced their lives. Today, we will hear the distinguished Dr. Cierra Kaler-Jones, class of 2015, who was named to Black Enterprise's 40 Under 40 list in 2022 for social impact. She joins us to discuss the power of storytelling for social change, in which she weaves examples from Black history with their relationship to navigating the present moment. We will be able to hear about her accomplishments in her career and how Douglas has influenced her life. I would also like to recognize Susan Lester, a former Zagoren lecturer who's here today, a fellow 1970 graduate with me. Welcome. I'm sure that my mom, Adelaide Marcus Zagoren, would be very happy that this lecture series continues in her honor and recognizes alums for the rest of us to learn from and admire. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We're thrilled that you could join us for this evening. Before we start the formal lecture and introduce our esteemed keynote speaker, I'd like to invite Jean Fox, class of 75, AADC president, to make brief remarks about the AADC.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Lee. On behalf of the AADC, the Associate Alumnae of Douglas College, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2023 Zagoren Lecture. We were really thrilled to host this event during Black History Month, and as we continue to celebrate the 100th anniversary of our beloved Alumni Association. We are also very honored to have Cierra Kaler-Jones, class of 2015, join us as this year's lecturer. Thank you, Cierra, for being with us today, discussing storytelling for social change, stories of justice and joy for a more just future. The Zagoren Lecture is made possible, as you've heard, by an endowment created through gifts, honoring the leadership of the late Adelaide Marcus Zagoren, class of 40, former executive director of the AADC, and I must say, a role model for so many of us, including myself. It's our pleasure to have Laura Zagoren Barron, class of 70, Adelaide's daughter, who we've just heard from, in attendance with us. Laura has been a leader in her class as well as a consistent donor to AADC and an advocate for the AADC. So we're very grateful for Laura's leadership as an alumna and as president of our invaluable partner, the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation. Thank you, Laura. And as Leah mentioned, the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation is our conference benefactor for the AADC 100th Anniversary Women's Conference, Women Moving Forward. Thank you, Laura, for that as well. This powerful and inspiring all-day in-person conference will take place on Saturday, March 18th at the Hilton on East Brunswick Hotel and Executive Meeting Center, right on exit 9 of the Turnpike. So, and also please mark your calendar in addition to March 18, save the date for our AADC Alumni Reunion Weekend 2023, which will be held on Friday, June 2nd and Saturday, June 3rd, as we will welcome and salute the Vanguard class of 1973, as well as all the milestone classes ending in 3 and 8. Remember, reunion is open to all alumni, so even if it is not a milestone reunion year for you, you're very welcome to come back to campus and join us, have some fun and a memorable weekend. I also gratefully acknowledge the AADC Lecture Committee members and Leah, the chair, as well as our AADC staff liaison, Lizette Martinez, class of 13, for helping make this virtual event possible. It is because of volunteers like you and this committee that the AADC can continue to fulfill our mission to serve the needs and interests of our diverse alumni. It is thanks to alumni volunteers and leaders and supporters that the AADC has persisted and thrived for 100 years. We are proud of our very rich history, and we look forward to an even brighter future as we pave the way together to mark our next century of success. Thank you again, Laura, Cierra, and all those connected with us in this evening. Enjoy the lecture, and thank you for your unwavering support.
Thank you, Jean. I'm so looking forward to the Women's Conference and the AADC Alumni Reunion. Already have those dates booked. We'll now transition to today's formal lecture. During the lecture, we encourage attendees to engage in the chat room. You can ask questions about the lecture there, and I will keep track of them for the Q&A session after the lecture. Please type questions in all caps and comments in lowercase. This way we can see the questions real quick. Alumni and friends will also have the opportunity to turn on their microphones and ask Cierra questions at the end of the presentation. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce Cierra Kaler-Jones. Dr. Cierra Kaler-Jones, she, her, is an educator, writer, researcher, and dancer based in the DC metro area. Born and raised in New Jersey, Cierra is a proud alumna of Rutgers University Douglas Residential College, where she earned a bachelor's degree in social work with minors in women's and gender studies and race and ethnic studies. She received her master's degree in education and human development from the George Washington University and her PhD in education from the University of Maryland, College Park. In 2014, Cierra became the second Black woman to win the title of Miss New Jersey and dedicated her year of service to offering free visual and performing arts lessons to students along the East Coast and advocating for equity in education. She recently became the inaugural executive director of Rethinking Schools, the nation's leading grassroots magazine for racial and social justice in education. Previously, she served as Director of Storytelling at Communities for Just Schools Fund and a graduate fellow consultant with the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. Through her commitment to education justice, she is also a member of the Zinn Education Project's leadership team and has consulted with organizations such as USAID and the National Geographic Society education team. She took her love of storytelling in all its forms and founded Unlock Your Story, an organization that helps women and organizations leverage storytelling and movement for liberation, community building, and social change. With her roots in dance and arts education, Cierra has also taught classes on U.S. history, public policy, storytelling, social change, and leadership. As a researcher, she and her co-authors' work can be found in journals like Middle School Journal, Girlhood Studies, the Urban Review, and Journal Committed to Social Change on Race and Ethnicity, magazines like Rethinking Schools, and books such as Strong Black Girls, Reclaiming Schools in Their Own Image. In 2020, she co-created a community-based program with Black girls that trains and supports them in organizing arts-based research and activism. She's also the co-facilitator of Seeding Disruption Remix, a youth organization fellowship for racial justice. Through her storytelling and education work, she has worked with several universities and colleges, including the Pennsylvania State University and Rutgers University, given over 300 talks and keynotes, including TEDx and South by Southwest EDU. She has led professional development workshops for educators and organizations across the country, and has been invited to present her work to senior officials at the U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Justice, and the White House. In 2022, she was named Black Enterprise's 40 Under 40 list in 2022 for social impact. Please welcome Cierra, our 2023 Zagoren Lecturer.
Thank you so much for that warm and thoughtful introduction, Lee, and thank you for all that you do. Before I get started, on behalf of the AADC Alumnae, I also want to heap on the love and appreciation and the thanks to Laura Zagoren Barron, the benefactor for tonight's lecture. We appreciate your support and your mother's legacy that flows through you. We're so grateful to and for you and this opportunity to bring alumni together. And it's so wonderful to be in this virtual space with alumni during this incredible 100th year. I see some of my classmates in the participant list, some friends, and then also family. My mom is here as well. So I'd love to get started. Sankofa. It is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. Go back and get it. The Ghanaian principle that guides my life. Meaning we must know our history in order to understand ourselves in the present, to be able to dream new futures. The Black tradition regards oral tradition of passing down our stories through song, dance, oral history as a way to inquire about culture, possibilities, and humanity. History is not only around us, but also within us. It's not something that just takes place in textbooks or out there, but rather it is something that we make each day. History is etched into the fabric of our loved ones' beings, of our own beings, and we can breathe life into the stories that make up the essence of who we are individually and collectively by exploring our stories, communicating them, and passing them on. So here, I pass down my story. The first time I ever shared my story, I was a junior in high school. Believe it or not, I was very shy. I was so shy that I hated raising my hand in class out of fear that I would have the wrong answer. But as a dancer since the age of 5, there was a moment where something happened. The Board of Education cut the arts programs in my local school district. And this is the first time in my life that I felt overwhelmingly passionate about something. So much so that I knew that I no longer could be silent, that I had to speak up. So I went to Board of Education meetings. I started to rally up community members, other students, teachers, my family got involved, anyone that I could get in contact with. I was trying to organize them so that we could save the arts programs. And I'll never forget one Board of Education meeting where I had those small white note cards, and mine were a little crumpled because my palms were pretty sweaty and damp. And when they called for public comment, my legs started to shake as I slowly stood up and squeaked out, "I have something to say." And I told them my story, how as someone who would then go on to be a first-generation college student, that the arts were the key to opportunity for me. That it was the one place during the school day where I could come back to myself. It's where I could explore emotions that I didn't quite have words for. It is the place where I could just be, and I could be free. And so after that Board of Education meeting, we continued on in our organizing. We started a social media campaign. We wrote op-eds to the local newspaper. And then they had another board meetings to vote on the reinstatement of the arts program. And I remember sitting there again, still pretty shaky, nervous, palms are sweaty. And I looked at each board member as they shared their vote. They went around, it was yay, 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 yay. And they got to the last board member and she found me in the crowd. She looked me in the eye and said, "It is because of you that I will always vote yay to arts education." And I learned an important lesson that day, that my story, my voice, the shy girl from South Jersey, that I was valuable, that my voice was valuable, and that I could create change. And so I made it my mission to encourage others to share their stories, but I soon realized how storytelling was already woven into my daily experiences. At Douglas, I remember sitting in my first Women's and Gender Studies class, Knowledge and Power, Issues in Women's Leadership, for which I then went on to become a Barbara Voorhees mentor. So put in the chat if you are also a Barbara Voorhees mentor. And as we were reading the theory about sexism and racism and the intersections of multiple oppressed systems of power and domination, I saw that there was language for my experience. There was theory for my experience. And when I was able to name and define injustice, I found that I was also to think about how I could dismantle it. As Bell Hooks said, in quotes, I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing. I also found community. And I saw that everyone around me in my class was also raising their hands about how the theory gave a vocabulary to their experience. And I realized that my experience was not an individual one or an isolated one, but it was collective, that we were a community. But I saw systems at play. And then again, as a dance teacher, I remember my students, who are mostly Black girls, they were coming to class so jazzed about learning, exploring, experimenting, and honing their craft. They would rush into the dance studio to tell me about their days, but they would also share their frustrations with me. They would say things like, Miss Sierra, can we learn about Africa? I haven't learned anything about the whole continent of Africa at school. Can we learn about Black history? Can we have a girl power day? Can we talk about current events? There's so much going on and I want to do something to make change. And then I realized my students' stories weren't being highlighted in research. So I went back to school to think about how I could shift those narratives. Stories are a tool, a gateway, a doorway, a passage to understanding, to reckoning, to believing, to understanding, to loving. And I myself am a mosaic of the stories that I've collected, a compilation of the stories of the people that I've loved, the places that I've experienced, the dances that I've danced, and the lessons that I've learned. This is my why, to create space for new stories, never heard before stories. In a world where dominant narratives that privilege certain experiences over others prevails, to put dreams into words of a better, more equitable future as we collectively dream of living in the world that we all deserve. And much of how we engage in learning about history actually comes from stories. The stories we tell shape our beliefs and values, which influence our actions, which contributes to whether we uphold or dismantle the status quo. So much of what narratives are prevalent are based on power. Who has the power to share the story, to shape the story, to make it the only story? And so it's Black History Month, and I continue to lean into the power and the beauty of Black history, of Black present, but also Black futures in this month and beyond. And there are many stories throughout Black history that I wish I would have learned earlier. So much of what I learned was the same as my students, only seeing my ancestors represented in pain or captivity without highlighting the resistance, creativity, joy, beauty. And this story gives way to dehumanization. Yet there are so many stories that could be shared. I want to share a few of them with you. To illustrate, when I first saw my ancestors in the curriculum, they were enslaved. But the first African people who were on this stolen land were not. For example, Isabel de Overa. In 1600, she joined Juan Guerra de Resa's expedition to New Mexico as a servant to a Spanish woman. But before joining, she petitioned the mayor of Querétaro, Mexico, for formal documentation that would protect her freedom. Her appeal ended with the most powerful word. She said, "I demand justice." Another one of my favorite stories from history. In the 18th century, there were Tignon laws in Louisiana. They forced Black women to wear head wraps because they often wore these elaborate styles that incorporated beads and feathers, which attracted a lot of attention. And so the Tignon laws made it so that Black women had to wear head wraps to signify that they were a part of a lesser class, even if they were free. So as a form of resistance, Black women wore the head wraps, but they decorated them with the brightest, most colorful patterns, ornate beads, and jewels to let everyone know that they were here. It was a policy created to reinforce social order and racial hierarchies. However, Black women used it as a tool to express individuality and resist colonization. Another story, take one of my favorite figures to learn about in history, Mrs. Rosa Parks. In the words of historian Jean Theo Harris, in quotes, the story of the Montgomery bus boycott is often told in ways that make it hard to imagine how to do it, in part because it seems to just happen, right? It seems like Rosa Parks sit down, people are enraged, there's a boycott, they win. And we're told that she's just this accidental heroine when she'd been organizing for years. And this master narrative, as Julian Bond named it, it lifts up this idea of the hero myth, the idea that there will be individuals that rise up and save us, which erases the power of the collective in making change. The story that gets passed down about Rosa Parks being a tired old seamstress is false. She had long been an organizer and advocate for women who were sexually assaulted. She was highly active in defending the Scottsboro Boys. She organized against apartheid, but she also struggled with mental health because people tried to make her feel like she didn't know what she was doing. And in her later years, she turned to yoga as a way to rest and take radical care of herself. And this is one of my favorite things. In interviews, her nieces and nephews even giggle when they talk about their Auntie Rosa showing up to their homes wearing her yoga pants. And others have also turned to yoga throughout history. I think about Erica Huggins of the Black Panther Party and Angela Davis, who have both discussed their experience turning to yoga and meditation after being imprisoned for their organizing. It was the Black Panther Party that truly revolutionized the term self-care before it was co-opted, recognizing that when the government and healthcare systems wouldn't take care of them, they had to take care of themselves and each other. And in these stories, I saw myself as part of a rich legacy of storytellers, of freedom fighters, of activists and artists who were, and in the words of Toni Cade Bambara, making the revolution irresistible. That's one of the things that I loved most about my time at Douglas, was where a lot of my organizing, where a lot of my activism was cultivated. It was supported, it was loved on, it was affirmed in community with other women. And another thing that I loved about my time at Douglas is that we passed down so many stories. We passed down ghost stories, but we also passed down stories about the women who came before us. Adelaide Zagoren, Mabel Smith Douglas, Julia Baxter Bates, Joel Plummer Cobb, and a community of 39,000 plus strong, powerful, equipped women. And with being storytellers comes responsibility. Research shows that we can actually move people to action with our stories, whether that action be in service of social change or not. Our brains do fascinating things when hearing a story. For example, mirror neurons are activated, meaning that when we hear or see something, someone else telling a story, the story becomes real in our own bodies. We start to sweat a little bit when something is stressful and cortisol is activated. We feel a deep sense of empathy when something resonates with us because of oxytocin. And interestingly, researchers have found that the more cortisol and oxytocin that's released in hearing a story, the more likely people are to act, to donate, to sign the petition, to show up to the rally, to vote. So with that in mind, we can't just share stories. We have to be strategic. And when we compile and collect story after story, they become building blocks to actually create a larger narrative. And it's important to note that there's a difference between narrative strategy and narrative power building. The organization Reframe describes narratives as explaining how society should work. The strategy piece of this is asking questions like, who is our audience? Or as I learned from Reframe, who are our persuadables in the middle? not our base, the people that are already bought into our message, and not the opposition who is strongly against our narrative, but who is in the middle that could be persuaded to join our side. And how do we use language that is familiar and accessible to them to get them on our side? And where is our audience? What values do they have? Or as I joke with the graduate students that I teach, what does our audience eat for breakfast? We need to know them that well. And you want to know and study them inside out and then develop project goals, narrative goals. In other words, what can you do and what can you say to persuade them? But more importantly to me, to motivate, to inspire them to see what is possible. And on the narrative power piece, Rashad Robinson at Color for Change says, narrative power is the ability to change the norms and rules our society lives by. So in order to build power, we have to know where and who holds power and remind ourselves that we hold power too. This is where strategic organizing comes in. We have to build bases of folks who believe in our message. We have to develop campaigns that will reach our persuadable audiences. And we have to be persistent. And I know Douglas women know all about being persistent. Research shows that people need to engage with a message 7 to 11 times before they actually internalize it. And narrative power building also means that if we don't tell our stories, others will try to tell them for us and then make those the definitive story. And so while we try to get our narratives into mainstream media, we also have to simultaneously forge our own spaces so we can tell our stories in our own ways. For example, Rethinking Schools, where I serve as executive director, is a publisher that is led by organizers and educators and centers the stories of educators, students, organizers, and activists. The founders forged a space for us to call out harmful curriculum and policy, but also share teaching and organizing strategies that give glimpses of what bell hooks called the classroom as a radical site of possibility. We also host workshops for educators and organizers to support them in writing their own stories. We have to do both, engage in a both and strategy. And so to build narrative power, here are a few things that I've learned. 1, we have to provide an affirmative vision. One of my favorite quotes comes from Robin D.G. Kelly, and he said, "Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down." So in a lot of the narrative power building sessions I lead, I start with a visioning exercise. What would your dream school or your dream world look and feel like? And then we move backwards from the vision. What would it actually take for us to get there? And while we seek to dismantle harmful systems, we also have to share what is possible. As an example, 1 Million Experiments, a podcast out of Interrupting Criminalization, the work of Andrea Ritchie and Mariam Kaba, they have a beautiful tagline for the podcast that illustrates the affirmative, exploring snapshots of community-based projects that expand our ideas about what keeps us safe. What keeps us safe? Emphasizing safety and showing what can be possible and who is already doing the work to reimagine safety, to make it tangible to persuadable audiences. 2, we have to counter harmful narratives with humanity. Right now, there is dangerous legislation that has either been introduced or passed in 42 states and counting that bans critical conversations about racism and oppression in schools. There have been at least 155 anti-LGBTQ+ bills introduced, anti-organizing legislation, and so much more. And the opposition is using fear tactics to mobilize people. The fear is of feeling hard feelings. But in reality, if we continue to ignore our hard history, we reproduce it. Because in order to disrupt something, we have to first acknowledge it. Like my time in knowledge and power issues in women's leadership, reading that theory gave me a name so that I could then go and understand how we could collectively dismantle those structures. But fear tactics are oftentimes the easiest stories to sell. So how do we do that? How do we counter it? Part of what we've been lifting up in our work is love. We love people and we love a world that doesn't exist yet, so much so that we want to create a better world for them. And to love people is to tell them the truth. Truth telling is a form of love, and we have to grapple with the truth of the past to learn from it and to be able to dream new futures. As June Jordan said in quotes, to tell the truth is to become beautiful, to begin to love yourself, value yourself. And that's political in its most profound way. And so how did we come to love? We thought, what is a universal need? We all want to love and belong. We want better for our society. And the only way to do that is to address harm and work through it together. So as an example, as an education project where I'm on the leadership team, we developed a Teach Truth campaign to encourage educators and allies to teach the truth, regardless of the law. Over the past few years, we've had rallies all across the country where folks publicly pledge to tell the truth and not lie to students. This is using affirmative language. What do we want people to do? We want them to teach the truth rather than trying to tell them what we don't want them to do, because affirmative strategies are some of the most effective in narrative building. And lastly, third, building stories of the future takes time, community, and rest. We can't do this in isolation or without restoration. Those who benefit from systems of oppression don't want us to be joyful or well, because we can't show up to the movement if we are exhausted, run down, or unwell. And it's hard to dream beyond the present moment when we are just trying to survive. This is one of the harms of how capitalism has manifested in the United States, that we are told that we have to keep working, keep churning, because it falsely places our value on our work. But Douglas women know that we are so many things, and we can be so many things, and we are more than just our work. We're community, we're humans that are creative and powerful. We are complex, nuanced humans with robust lives, and we will not be robbed of our humanity. So let us share our stories with vigor, purpose, and intention. Let us share stories of joy as an act of resistance of these systems that do not want us to take up space. And as Bell Hooks said, and love is a practice of freedom, working within community, whether it be sharing a project with another person or with a larger group, we are able to experience joy and struggle. That joy needs to be documented, for if we only focus on the pain, the difficulties which are surely real in any process of transformation, we only show a partial picture. It's our work to be able to share a more fuller picture and not only show the difficulties, but also the joy and the resistance as well. So in sum, our strategy, we must, one, dream, provide an affirmative vision. What can be possible when we do this work and we do this work together? Secondly, turn our attention to building power. We can't just simply share stories, and stories are so important. It's how we build community. It's how we get to know one another. But we have to share them strategically. And we have to couple storytelling and narrative building with organizing and action. And then third, lean into community care. I learned so much of this from my time at Douglas in the relationship building and all of the sessions and the workshops and the conferences and the convenings. And even now being on the other side as an alumna, all of the ways that we get to continue to engage, the ways that we are invited back, because Douglas knows all about community care, all about how we have to continue taking care of each other, continue strategizing together, and continue supporting one another. That's one of the most beautiful things about Douglas, is it doesn't leave once you graduate, rather it continues on. And so the same stories that have been told in different ways, these stories that evoke strong emotions like fear, we can use those same tools for storytelling for the good. Stories that inspire, that make us feel, that encourage us to dream. It is ordinary, everyday people like you and me that spark movements. At Douglas, we are a movement. So what if we use the converse of fear? What if we use inspiration and hope and new visions to drive narratives forward? Narratives that build worlds that are centered in justice, in joy, love, community, and care. What could be possible? What stories could we tell? What possibilities could we create? And what new world could we build? Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have some questions in the chat. First of all, that was fantastic, phenomenal, kind of just what a tired teacher really needed to hear after everything. So just going kind of in order of the chat, our first question was, how do you get the young girl who believes she's unloved without talent from a home that's unstable? And this is a concern of a major concern, because so many girls, especially girls of color, have or feel they have no one to turn to. So how do we reach out to those voices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that really inspires and motivates me about Adelaide Zagoren's lifelong legacy is her work with the Girl Scouts. And I actually started my teaching career as a Girl Scout troop leader of a non-traditional troop. And so that's something that really grounds me in this particular question. But there are so many programs that provide young people spaces to explore and to experiment with what they're good at. I think that schooling, and I believe education is different than schooling. Schooling is a tool for colonization and conformity, where education is a lifelong process that we get to engage in learning. But what schooling is ultimately looks like right now is something that forces young people to put themselves into boxes. And so creating spaces for students to explore things that they're interested in, whether it be dance, whether it be art, whether it be sports, whether it be fashion, whether it be social media and creating content, whatever that might be, letting them explore and letting them be seen and heard. And I also know from my experience in organizing a program for young Black girls, creating those spaces for them, but also having them be a part of a community. I think that's why places like Douglas are so special, Girl Scouts, Boys and Girls Clubs, just allowing them to see themselves reflected. And with the work that I've been able to do with Black girls, one of the things that they have always lifted up as a suggestion of school is just to be able to see their own stories represented, whether that be in the curriculum or whether that just be in supplemental curriculum that we're able to bring in. Because then, like in my own story, being able to see myself as a part of a legacy certainly helped me to think beyond what could be possible. So those are some suggestions that I would provide.
Excellent, thank you. So, and this happens to be mine, what steps can teachers, who are engaged in that schooling, and specifically public schools, take to develop these stories with students and to tap into their truths and the greater truths, especially with so much opposition? We're in New Jersey, where we kind of see what's going on elsewhere, and some of it hasn't hit us yet, but North Jersey, they were just one of the libraries, I think it was Glen Rock, they had an issue with people wanting to ban some books. And so how do we as teachers tackle this?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I would say that there are so many resources and so many teacher organizing groups. I know at Rethinking Schools where I work, we bring together teachers to strategize, but also to write their stories. So I would say one, tap into some groups that already have curriculum created and see how you can bring those into your classroom and to be able to adapt those. Another thing that I'll name is that I wrote this piece for Rethinking Schools about a year ago about some of the work that I've done with Black girls, specifically around oral history. And so one of the ways that we can bring storytelling into classrooms is encouraging young people to bring their own stories. And so I have this whole process that I went through with them and encouraging them to just develop an interview protocol. I get to turn into a really nerdy researcher sometime, but we created this collective interview protocol where I just asked them, when textbooks write the story of history happening right now, what stories would you want them to share? And that's how we came up with oral histories, because they wanted to interview their moms and their aunties and their grandmas and people in their community to think about what they were experiencing in this present moment, in this history that we're creating. And so then they went out, they collected that information and they brought it back to the classroom. And so being able to bring their own stories, I also think helping them write their own sort of memoirs and their own reflections, critical thinking is so key. And so even when you have this prescripted curriculum, another thing that's been really helpful for me is just asking critical questions of, well, who do you think is telling this story? And why are they telling this story? And what's another way that we can bring other stories in? And so often students will just bring things that they found on the internet and they'll want to talk about it. So I think just extending that invitation to bring outside material from the students, because then they're really leading and thinking critical about their own materials that they're bringing in. And that feels to me like a way that we can be really thoughtful and intentional, even amidst this legislation, right? Because right now we see in Florida with DeSantis and trying to ban the AP African American Studies course. And just so you all know, Rethinking Schools, one of the things that we've just recently organized is book donations. So we're collecting donations and we've been able to raise enough to send 246 books. Of Teaching for Black Lives is one of our books to Florida teachers. So I think organizing is another component of that. Find other teachers that are aligned and get that support, because again, we can't do this in isolation. It has to be a collective effort.
Thank you so much. Definitely looking up Rethinking Schools. So another question kind of related, what do you think we can do specifically and collectively to stop education systems from changing and erasing the historic narratives of African and Native Americans?
Ooh, that's a good question. And also the question that keeps me up at night, because I'm still trying to figure out it too. And so I appreciate that question, Mallory. You know, I think one piece, again, is just the organizing is being really strategic. Because right now what we're seeing is that the opposition is very well funded and highly vocal. So one thing that we've been encouraging people to do is to show up at school board meetings, because this is where a lot of those decisions are being made. Have your voice heard there. And also write, if you like to write op-eds, get your story out there, get the story of teachers out there, because one thing that is very jarring is that a lot of the way the story of this moment is being told is that, oh, well, you know, this is happening in Florida, or this is happening in Iowa, or this is happening in Texas. And like you said, Lee, there are parts of northern New Jersey where this is happening. I got an email from a teacher in Massachusetts who had a Black Lives Matter sign up in her classroom, and the superintendent is trying to take legal action against her. Massachusetts, right? So I think showing up at school board meetings whenever you can, writing op-eds, and showing your support for teachers, because I know right now teachers are overwhelmed and being pushed in all sorts of different directions, right? Because on top of this, and this is all very strategic, right? On top of everything that's happening, because this is all pushback from the racial justice uprisings of the summer of 2020. And so what we're seeing now in this moment is that pushback. And there's also a teacher shortage on top of it. And there's a very strategic reason why. If we don't have teachers, it'll be much easier to control people, to have them tell the lies that the curriculum wants them to lift up. So have your voice be heard, sign petitions. We have a Teach Truth pledge that I can put in the chat if folks are interested in being involved in that way. And then in June, we have our series of rallies where teachers and allies all across the country show up at historic sites and pledge to teach the truth, or pledge to support educators who are teaching the truth. I think it's important for folks who are not educators to be able to show up in these spaces and let their voices be heard.
Thank you. And yes, please show up to school board meetings, because that's where a lot of these decisions are being made. And I can tell you, as a parent and a teacher, people don't show up to the meetings, and then they go, wait, how did that happen? Well, yeah, there's also research your candidates too, because I know even in Somerset County, there was a big push for candidates from a certain, I forget what the exact term that they used on their signs was, but when I looked it up, it was, aren't you concerned? And it was all about, gender inequity and tamping down the sex ed curriculum. And, for me as a parent, like, no, I'm concerned about you, not that. So a bit of a different direction. Many studies show that people react or act on negative statements versus positive ones, specifically in political ads. So any thoughts on how to deal with that phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a great question, Jean, and something that I actually explore in my class. So I also teach at Georgetown. I teach a class on storytelling for social change, and this is a conversation that we have quite often because it's called negativity bias. So people are very much more likely to lean towards things that are negative. And, it's even interesting to look at different elections as sort of case studies of this phenomena. So for example, with the 2016 presidential election, the Clinton campaign, they had field tested, I think, somewhere between 60 and 70 different messages, whereas the 45th presidential administration tested one, which was used from Ronald Reagan. It was recycled or stolen, however you want to call it. But, people are very much leaning towards that, the negativity bias. And so one way to kind of move people out of that, I think, is, again, just the affirmative and getting to people's core self. Another storytelling strategy is to create narratives that lean on the idea that people are inherently good and that speak to their best selves. And so when we speak to things that are positive, or when we speak to things that are affirmative, that share visions and possibilities for the future, then that also sort of shifts them a little bit away from the negativity bias into something a little bit more positive. But it is a huge challenge because we see so much of that, especially in storytelling theory and narrative theory.
Thank you so much for that. Another question, again, a little different. How can storytelling be used to help stop the rise in bullying in school and social media, especially with what we're hearing about girls bullying girls and the studies that have just come out about how teen girls specifically are facing higher rates of depression and suicidal thought?
Yeah, and this is so important. One of the things that I love about storytelling is that it creates space for us to do self-reflection and self-awareness work. A lot of what we see when it comes to bullying, when it comes to structures and systems of oppression, is actually grappling first with ourselves before we're able to have those conversations with other people. So storytelling inviting students to think about, what is your story and who are you and what are the things that make up who you are and what do you love to do and what excites you, what gets you out of bed in the morning, what frustrates you, what makes you angry. Those are all questions that I explore with my students. And I actually have a number of arts activities that I do with them. I have them draw. One of the activities that I did with young people is they drew a counter narrative self-image. So half of themselves they drew as how they view themselves, and the other half is sort of speaking to how they believe other people view them, and getting them to think about what is a counter narrative to sort of push back on what has been told about them before. Another activity that I've done before is also where you kind of trace yourself on the ground, and then you put stories about different pieces of who you are. So here's what my heart holds, here's what my hands hold, here's what my brain holds. And then we actually take strings and connect them to each other's drawings as a way to help us see the connections between one another. So I think, first and foremost, that self-reflection, who am I? What are the things that sort of ail me and hurt me? What is that pain? Because storytelling is also a healing modality. to be able to journal and to reflect on some of the frustrations that we have and those parts of our stories, right? Because we all hold pain in some way, shape, or form. And so that pain oftentimes manifests as, it could manifest as bullying because we're grappling with something internal. So I always give students an opportunity to reflect and write down what that means for them. And then there's also the other piece of being able to share stories with one another. So as another example, in my storytelling for change class, I start out with an Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is Zulu for I am because we are. And I just use that instead of the term icebreaker to bring my community into the classroom. And we start out with a question like, what brings you to this space? Or what's a moment that you're most proud of? What's something that excites you? And so getting them to answer those questions, and then they go into pairs and they share with one person that they haven't talked to yet before. And so we can also use storytelling to build deeper relationships with one another.
Thank you. I love that idea of just having the tracing with connecting each other. And I feel like starting with, is that an Ubuntu, is so much more, I think, intentional than just an icebreaker, because it really sets a really specific tone and narrative structure for a course, rather than just a, get to know you kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also makes me think too of the indigenous practices of restorative justice. And oftentimes restorative justice has been co-opted to have people think that it's just something that we use when there has been harm done, but it's actually a community building. So I do that with students as well. We engage in the practice of circle keeping, and each person has the opportunity to share a little bit about themselves and their stories in response to a prompt. And one of the things that I just so much appreciate about the practice of circle keeping is being on level with one another, even in the ways that we sit. If we sit in a circle is different than, me being the teacher or the lecturer and standing in front of them, but really sort of seeing each other or engaging with each other at the same sort of space so that we're able to dig in a little bit more deeply.
Excellent. Thank you. Those are all the questions that I've seen posted in the chat. If anybody has any other questions, wants to raise a hand, come off mute, engage. I see, Marcia, you have a hand up.
Introduce yourself. My name's Mary Elizabeth O'Connor. I'm Marcia's spouse. I taught in Somerset County for many years. And I think one of the things that we have to do as well is open the doors. Stop structuring everything. Stop being in charge.
Yes.
Let the kids and the let the students teach us. I have this deep belief, which is this, that college education, Douglas and elsewhere, never did me all that much good. Where I learned how to teach about life's realities in the English literature classroom was when the students taught me. And I think we have to stop acting like we are the big mamu in control. The other thing I would suggest is to urge teachers to run for boards of education. Stop moaning about boards of education. Become them. And if you have a 7-member board, you need 4 good people on that board to control the future of everything. And I see so many educators rushing to Florida, God knows why, in order after they retire, or playing tennis instead of continuing to work to change the communities and the shape of education. Now, because Marcia Anderson, I went to Misericordia University. Marcia is a Douglas woman.
69.
She's been trying to get me to shut up for all the years we've known one another.
It hasn't worked.
That was a whole word. Yes.
But she did run after she retired from North Plainfield School District. She did run and win for the school board where she was on the board for 10 years. So you
Awesome.
do that.
Yes.
You know, what's interesting is you're a known quantity. You already have an electorate that's going to elect you. So go do it.
Although that requires living where you teach.
Yes.
Or, well,
And that,
well,
or
run
where
where you don't, or run where you don't teach. You don't have to
That's
change.
true.
We're not in cages.
Mhm.
You can influence high quality education wherever you go. And the key is it's got to be open. We got to stop thinking in these little structures and walls. By the way, my current interest is the NAACP. I've been a member since I was about 16. And yes, it too is a structure, but wow, lots of things can happen. The other thing is open your door. How many kids have you had in your home who are not your own kids? Think about it. I don't even have kids.
I do.
I love it.
And the other thing is I stopped these people at the pass. Some guy who subs in Bridgewater said to me the other night, I was at something, O'Connor was at the Jewish Community Center. And I said, the guy says to me, you know, kids today, I say, stop. Because anything a kid is today, you're the one who's responsible for it. So shut up. Don't be nice.
Yes. Let them
Look
know.
at how weary Marcia is.
Teacher.
I love.
I bring her to.
Okay.
all right, Bernice.
I'm laughing so much.
Comedy is over.
I started out by, I was going to start out by saying amen to Reverend Cierra. And then I was going to say I did them all. I was a teacher,
Yes.
Board of Education member, assistant superintendent, and then superintendent. So I did the whole thing, and Cierra is right on the money. But let me just mention what I want to say. Cierra, you started at the very beginning. You said something about coming from the family. Several of your ancestors had been in servitude.
Mhm.
And basically in our New Jersey education, especially during my time in public schools when I was a kid growing up, we only learned about a very few things, but there were so many movements that occurred that touched not only Black people, but white people. And it is a shame that those movements, thank God for the media, has certainly in the more recent years done something to tell people a little bit more about the movements that have affected all of us.
Mhm.
Case in point, Reconstruction, as short as it was, I never knew anything about it until I started doing research on antebellum Florida. Now, I am a graduate of Douglas and Rutgers. I'm sorry, folks, if any professors are out there who think they taught me, but they probably didn't. I did not ever hear anything about Reconstruction and the role that so many people played. I never heard anything about the major migration of Black Americans from the South to the North. Even my relatives that came to New Jersey, they were a part of that migration. Why did they come north? Because they really couldn't take it any longer in the South with all that was going on through the early 20s all the way up to the 50s or just before the movement. So I'm saying that we have missed out on so many, and I could go on and on. I mean, just take a look at what is going on right now in the media, something that is an eye opener for me. Another one of the movements, or I should say a period in time, was the Gilded Age. there were so many African Americans who were doing well during the Gilded, and we didn't know anything about it. All we knew about were the people who were involved with the locomotives and oil. We didn't know that there were a class, a group of African Americans who were doing very highly educated, doing very well. And I said all of this only to commend you for thinking along the lines of thinking out of the box and coming up with ways to grab, like I said earlier, the little girl who thinks nothing of herself, maybe get children involved in the role playing, like you said earlier, going into the period of time, dressing up as if they were in the Reconstruction period, dressing up as if they were in the Gilded Ages, and becoming somebody, because there were so many somebodies, Black and white, and we missed all of that. I am not kidding you. I went to public schools, and I want to say I went to a very good public school, but I never learned any of this information until I became an adult. And I think that's horrible, because it reminds me of the paucity of generational literacy, not the literacy that tells us about who cooked what and who had what recipe and who did this and who. I'm talking about knowing about your past, knowing about your ancestors. And I'm so glad you started out by saying what you said, because it reminded me that I wanted to say something about these movements that affect all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Yes. And I just dropped a link in the chat too, because you mentioned Reconstruction. So it's an education project. We have a whole campaign to teach Reconstruction. And last January, we came out with a report that looked into all of the state curricular standards for Reconstruction and found out that it is not great. So I am right there with you.
Thank you.
Wilma, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cierra. I think the point that you made emphasizes the importance for each and every one of us to vote in local elections. Everyone does not have the appetite to seek an elected position, but we can vote in the local elections. The emphasis seems to be on state and national elections, but what impacts us on a day-to-day basis is what happens in the municipalities and townships in which we reside. And I think that message was very clear tonight, and thank you very much.
Absolutely. Two more questions in the chat. How can we practice storytelling daily or engage in this practice on a regular basis for self-healing and for more inspiring and empowering moments?
I love this question. There are so many things, so many ways that we can practice storytelling. You know, first and foremost, I'll say that pretty much everything that we do and ways that we engage are through storytelling. Whether it is in a conversation with someone else and someone's like, oh, well, I remember this one time when, or we are engaging with the news or something we see on social media, all of this happens through stories. And storytelling is expansive, right? Because storytelling, you know, for me is dance. I best tell my story through movement. For storytelling for other people, it might be in cooking, right? Creating and curating a dish, right? And thinking about what spices and what seasonings can go into a dish to sort of tell a story about culture. But storytelling can also be, of course, reading and writing and sharing and speaking. And so I say, find the ways that you best tell your story, engage in this practice. I've been through many writing workshops and also lead a number of writing workshops. And one thing that's really hard for me as someone who does a lot of nonfiction personal narrative work is to try and write fiction. And so I always encourage people to engage in fictional practices. And that's where that dreaming comes in that I was talking about, where we can sort of tell stories and bring us to particular moments. And so I encourage people in their storytelling practice to think about all of the senses. What did something feel like? What did it taste like? What did it smell like, et cetera, for ways to really think about how we can make these moments come alive for us and do it in a sustained practice. So every day writing down some of these moments and these stories, because we might forget years later, right? There's an element of fiction in that story that I shared about my own experience at the Board of Education meeting. I remember having the note cards. My legs were probably shaky, but I don't have that actually written down somewhere. So we can add that creative liberty to some of our own stories by capturing some moments each and every day.
Excellent. And then the last one, do you have any strategies in this time of social media, how to keep messages out there, given that people need to hear the message so many times for that message to stick?
Yeah, this is great. So one thing that I think a lot about, and I talk to my students about, and what I've learned from them is always the concept of working smarter. And so when we talk about working smarter in terms of content and the age of social media and putting messages out there, if you have content in one form, you can actually create it in all sorts of forms. So for example, if I put together a social media post, if I put together an Instagram post, for example, I can put that content on Twitter, I can put that content on Facebook, I can put that content on LinkedIn, but I also can turn it into a YouTube video and record myself talking about it, or I can take that content and write an op-ed about it and try to pitch it at a local outlet. So there are many ways that we can think about taking the content that we already have and then putting it in multiple places, but also just making sure that you are continuing to put out the same content on the same outlets. So if you put it on Facebook, the research shows, again, 7 to 11 times before it sticks for someone. Don't be afraid to continue posting it, because the reality of how the social media algorithms work is people probably won't see it the first through the fifth times that you share it out. So be comfortable, be bold, and continue to have your story be out there. Because I work with a lot of women, especially as a coach, a storytelling coach, who are always afraid of putting their stories out there and continuing to put their stories out there. And society makes it that way for us, right? We might experience backlash or pushback, but we have to keep taking up that real estate. We have to keep putting our stories out there, even if it is 7 to 11 times, and making sure that people know what we stand for, what we're about, and to not back down, even when there is backlash.
I love that idea of just be bold and be repetitive so that it does stick.
Yeah, all about persistence. So, and I always tell people too that the right people will hear your message. And even as I share my own story and try to be vulnerable in that process, is that it's not always easy to share our stories. That's why care is so important. And it can be scary. It can be nerve-wracking. It's very vulnerable to share your story and put it out there. So I always say that the right people, the right person will engage with your story. And you never know when somebody is going to see something, hear something, read something that you have put out there, that was the thing that changed their day, or that was the thing that changed their mindset. So yes, I double down, continue to be bold.
And if nothing else, Douglas women are bold.
Absolutely. Bold and brave, all
Yep.
of the things.
All right. I think that concludes our lecture, our Zagoren lecture for this evening. Thank you so much for a wonderful, illuminating, passionate presentation.